The leather notebook felt heavy in Victoria Nolan's hands as the stagecoach rattled into Tonopah, Nevada, kicking up clouds of dust that turned the September afternoon sun into a hazy orange globe. She had traveled nearly 3,000 miles from Boston to document what her professor called the dying traditions of the American West. And now, in 1885, watching rough-hewn buildings slide past her window, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice hoarse from trail dust. Victoria gathered her carpet bag and camera equipment, careful not to jostle the precious glass plates wrapped in wool. The other passengers, a mining engineer and two prospectors, barely glanced at her as they disembarked. She was accustomed to being invisible, the studious daughter of a Harvard professor who had encouraged her peculiar interests in anthropology and the fading crafts of pre-industrial societies. At 23, she had published 2 papers on New England basket weaving and 1 on Pennsylvania Dutch quilting. The American West represented her most ambitious project yet. The main street of Tonopah stretched before her, a collection of false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. A blacksmith's hammer rang out somewhere nearby, and the smell of sage and horses hung thick in the air. Victoria had written ahead to secure lodging at the only boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She adjusted her sensible brown traveling dress and lifted her chin, determined not to appear as overwhelmed as she felt. "You must be Miss Nolan." A woman in her 50s approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I am Sarah Patterson. Welcome to Tonopah, though I cannot imagine what brings a young lady like yourself to our dusty corner of Nevada." "Traditional crafts," Victoria said, extending her hand. "I am conducting research on saddle making, leatherwork, rope braiding, and other skills that are being lost to industrialization." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Well, that is certainly different. Most young ladies who come west are either running from something or chasing a husband." "I am doing neither," Victoria said firmly. "I am a serious researcher." The boarding house proved clean and modest, with whitewashed walls and simple pine furniture. Mrs. Patterson showed Victoria to a small room on the second floor that overlooked the main street. After unpacking her notebooks, pencils, and photographic equipment, Victoria sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself one moment of doubt. What if no one would speak with her? What if the craftsman she sought had already vanished, replaced by factory-made goods shipped by rail? She opened her leather journal and began making notes about the town's layout, the types of buildings, the state of the roads. Documentation was her shield against uncertainty. If she could record and catalog, she could make sense of the world. The next morning, Victoria set out with her notebook and a list of potential contacts. The blacksmith seemed the logical place to start. She found the shop easily, following the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil. The building was open on 3 sides, with a massive forge glowing orange in the center. A man who must have been 60 stood at the anvil, his massive arms bringing the hammer down with practiced precision. "Excuse me," Victoria called over the noise. He looked up, squinting at her through the smoke. "Help you, miss. My name is Victoria Nolan. I am researching traditional crafts and would very much like to observe your work and ask you some questions about blacksmithing techniques." He set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You want to watch me work?" "Yes, and document your methods. I am particularly interested in traditional techniques that predate industrial manufacturing." The blacksmith, who introduced himself as Henry Morrison, scratched his beard. "Well, I have never had anyone want to watch before except apprentices. Cannot pay you, though." I do not want payment. I want to learn and record your craft. He shrugged. Suit yourself. But it is hot, dirty work, not fitting for a lady. I am not concerned with what is fitting, Victoria said. I am concerned with what is true. She spent the morning watching Henry work, filling pages with sketches and notes about his techniques. He was shaping horseshoes, explaining how each had to be custom-fitted to the individual animal. His knowledge was encyclopedic, passed down from his father and grandfather, but he had no children to teach. The craft would die with him. As noon approached, Henry paused to wipe his face. If you are interested in traditional crafts, you should talk to Quinton Thorne. He runs a ranch about 5 miles north of town. Best saddle maker in 3 counties, maybe in all of Nevada. Does everything the old way, from tanning his own leather to hand-tooling every design. Stubborn as a mule about it too. Refuses to buy anything factory-made if he can help it. Victoria's heart quickened. This was exactly what she sought. Would he be willing to speak with me? Only one way to find out. But I warn you, Quinton is particular about his privacy, does not come to town much. Some folks say he is strange, living out there alone, doing everything himself. How would I reach his ranch? You would need a horse, and you would need to know the way. Tell you what, I have to deliver some pieces to him tomorrow. You can ride along if you do not mind sitting in a wagon. Victoria agreed immediately, her mind already racing with questions she would ask this saddle maker who chose tradition over convenience. That evening, she wrote in her journal by lamplight, describing everything she had learned from Henry. But her thoughts kept drifting to this Quinton Thorne, the craftsman who apparently lived by principles that matched her own scholarly interests. She told herself it was purely academic curiosity, but she took extra care with her appearance the next morning, choosing her newer dress and pinning her dark hair more carefully than usual. Henry arrived with his wagon just after dawn. The ride north took them through scrubland dotted with sage and Joshua trees. The morning air was cool, though Victoria knew from experience that the afternoon would be scorching. Henry talked about the land, pointing out landmarks, explaining how the mining boom had changed Tonopah from a scattered collection of ranches to an actual town. There, Henry said finally, pointing to where the land rose into gentle hills. That is Quinton's place. The ranch was larger than Victoria had expected. A sturdy house stood beside a barn and several outbuildings, all constructed from local timber and stone. Corrals held perhaps 24 horses, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. Everything looked well maintained but simple, functional rather than decorative. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, and Victoria felt her breath catch slightly. Quinton Thorne was perhaps 28 or 29, tall and lean with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore work clothes, denim pants and a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms tanned dark by the sun. But it was his face that struck her, angular and strong with gray eyes that seemed to take in everything with quiet assessment. "Henry," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are early. Brought you those hinges you ordered, and a visitor." Henry gestured to Victoria. "This is Miss Victoria Nolan from Boston. She is studying traditional crafts." Quinton's gaze shifted to Victoria, and she felt suddenly exposed, as though those gray eyes could read every thought in her head. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I am not sure what you expect to find here." Victoria found her voice. "Mr. Morrison told me you are an exceptional saddle maker who uses traditional methods. I am documenting such crafts before they disappear. I was hoping you might allow me to observe and record your work." Something flickered in his expression, gone too quickly to identify. "I do not perform for audiences, Miss Nolan. I am not an audience, I am a researcher. I have published papers on traditional crafts. This is serious scholarly work. She heard the defensive edge in her voice and tried to soften it. Please, just an hour of your time. Let me show you what I do, and if you do not want me to continue, I will leave and not bother you again. Quinton was silent for a long moment, studying her with those unsettling gray eyes. Finally, he said, 1 hour. Henry, come on up to the house for coffee while I show Miss Nolan my workshop. The workshop was a separate building behind the main house, filled with the rich smell of leather and oil. Saddles in various stages of completion sat on wooden stands. Tools hung in precise order on the walls, everything from curved needles to stamps for tooling designs. Light streamed through wide windows, illuminating motes of dust in the air. Victoria walked slowly around the space, taking in everything. This is remarkable, she said softly. May I sketch the layout, if you must? She pulled out her notebook and began drawing quickly, noting the organization of tools, the types of leather stacked on shelves, the saddles themselves. Quinton watched in silence, arms crossed over his chest. Tell me about your process, she said, still sketching. Where do you start? With the hide. I tan my own leather using oak bark, the way my grandfather taught me. Takes longer than the commercial methods, but the leather is stronger, lasts longer. Factory tanneries use chemicals that weaken the fibers. How long does your process take? Months. The hides have to soak, then dry, then condition. Cannot rush it. He moved to one of the saddles, running his hand over the smooth leather. This one I started in April, be finished next week. Victoria stopped sketching and looked at him. That is 5 months for one saddle. Good work takes time. People today, they want everything fast and cheap, but fast and cheap does not last. My saddles, they will outlive the horses they are made for, might even outlive me. There was pride in his voice, but also something else. A kind of loneliness, perhaps, or defiance. Victoria moved closer to examine the saddle he was touching. The leather was tooled with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers, each line precise and flowing. Did you design this pattern? Yes, madam. Every saddle is custom. I make it for the specific horse and rider, and I tool designs based on what they want, or what I think suits them. It is beautiful. It is art. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw surprise in his eyes. Most people just see a saddle, a tool for riding. Then most people are not really looking. She pulled out her camera equipment. May I photograph this? And you working, if you will allow it. Quinton hesitated, and Victoria held her breath. Finally, he nodded. All right, but I warn you, I work slow, nothing exciting to watch. That is exactly what I want to see. The real process, not a performance. She set up her camera while Quinton returned to his workbench. He was fitting a sheepskin lining to a saddle, his hands moving with careful precision. Victoria watched through the viewfinder, adjusting the focus until his hands and the leather were sharp and clear. When she triggered the shutter, Quinton barely seemed to notice. The hour passed quickly, then another. Victoria filled pages with notes and sketches, asking questions about every step of his process. Quinton answered in his quiet, deliberate way, and gradually she noticed him relaxing, his responses becoming fuller, more detailed. He showed her how he hand-stitched the seams using wax thread, how he shaped the leather while it was wet, how he selected wood for the saddle tree. My grandfather was a saddle maker in Texas, he said, carefully trimming a piece of leather. He learned from Mexican craftsmen who learned from Spanish masters. This knowledge goes back centuries. But now everyone wants those fancy factory saddles from back east. Cheaper, faster to make. Never mind that they fall apart in a few years. Why did you come to Nevada? His hands stilled for a moment. After my grandfather died, I did not want to stay in Texas. Too many memories. Too many people trying to tell me I should give up saddle making and do something practical, like ranching or mining. So I came here, bought this land, figured I could make a living my own way. Do things right, even if it is harder. Victoria heard the echo of her own struggles in his words. How many times had people, even her own mother, suggested she give up her peculiar studies and focus on finding a husband? I understand that, she said quietly. The world does not always appreciate those who refuse to compromise. He looked at her again, and this time something passed between them, a moment of recognition. Two people who had chosen difficult paths because the easy ones felt like betrayal. Henry's voice calling from outside broke the spell. Miss Nolan, we should head back if we want to make town before dark. Victoria realized with shock that the sun was already low in the sky. She had been in the workshop for hours. I am so sorry, Mr. Thorne. I took far more than an hour of your time. You did. But I suppose it was not as bothersome as I expected. Was that the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth? You are welcome to come back if you have more questions. Really, you mean that? I do not say things I do not mean, Miss Nolan. On the ride back to Tonopah, Henry gave her a sideways look. Well, I will be. I have known Quinton Thorne for 3 years, and that is the most I have ever heard him talk. You must have some kind of magic. Not magic, just genuine interest. People will talk if you actually listen. But as the wagon rattled through the gathering dusk, Victoria knew it was more than that. Something had happened in that workshop, some connection she could not quite name. She told herself it was simply the satisfaction of finding an ideal research subject. But her heart was beating faster than scholarly excitement warranted. Over the following weeks, Victoria fell into a pattern. She would spend mornings in town, interviewing and documenting other craftspeople. A rope maker, a woman who wove blankets from sheep she raised herself, a cobbler who made boots to fit each customer's feet. But her afternoons belonged to Quinton Thorne. She convinced Mrs. Patterson to rent her a gentle mare, and she made the ride to the ranch several times a week. Quinton would be working in his shop or tending his horses, and he would nod when she arrived, a gesture that somehow conveyed both greeting and permission. Victoria would set up her camera or notebook, and they would fall into comfortable silence punctuated by questions and explanations. She learned that Quinton did more than make saddles. He braided rope from horsehair, crafted bridles and halters, made his own tools when he could not find what he needed. He was, she realized, living almost entirely outside the modern economy, producing what he needed with his own hands. It was a way of life that was rapidly disappearing, and documenting it became more important to her with each passing day. But it was not just the work that drew her back. It was the way Quinton's face softened when he talked about his grandfather's teachings. The rare smiles that appeared when he successfully completed a difficult piece. The way he listened when she talked about her own work, her theories about the importance of traditional knowledge, her frustration with professors who dismissed crafts as mere manual labor. They think scholarship is only about books and theories, she said one afternoon, sitting on a stool while Quinton shaped leather for a new saddle. They do not understand that knowledge lives in hands and practices, not just words on a page. Sounds like they are fools, Quinton said mildly. My father is not a fool, but he does not understand why I would rather study saddle making than host tea parties. What about your mother? Victoria's hand stilled on her notebook. She died when I was 12. Pneumonia. After that, my father buried himself in his books and I buried myself in mine. I suppose we were both just trying to survive. Quinton set down the leather and looked at her with those penetrating gray eyes. I am sorry. That must have been hard. It was, but it also freed me in a way. Without a mother pushing me toward conventional expectations, I could pursue my own interests. My father did not really notice what I was studying as long as my marks were good. She managed a small smile. What about you? You mentioned your grandfather, but what about your parents? My mother died in childbirth when I was 16. The baby, too. My father, he just gave up after that. He was never the same. Died 2 years later. The doctor said it was his heart, but I think he just did not want to live without her. The raw pain in his voice made Victoria's chest tight. I am so sorry, Quinton. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he noticed, his eyes widening slightly. Victoria, he said, testing her name in his low voice, and something warm unfurled in her chest. After that, something shifted between them. The conversations grew longer, more personal. Quinton began showing her other aspects of the ranch, teaching her how to read the land, how to spot good water sources, how to judge a horse's temperament. Victoria found herself sharing stories from her childhood, her dreams for her research, her fears that her work would never be taken seriously. One October afternoon, as they stood watching his horses graze in the golden light, Quinton said quietly, "You know, you could document more than just the saddle making. The whole way of life out here, it is changing fast. In 10 years, 20, it might all be gone." Victoria turned to him, struck by the idea. "You are right. It should be a broader study. The interconnection of all these traditional skills, how they form a complete way of living." "You could stay," he said, still looking at the horses rather than at her. "Not just for a few hours at a time. Really immerse yourself in it. I have space. The ranch house has extra rooms. You could document everything properly." Her heart began to race. "Quinton, I could not. It would not be proper, an unmarried woman staying at a man's ranch. I know that." He finally looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "But Victoria, I am not suggesting anything improper. I am suggesting that your research is important enough to risk propriety, and that maybe, just maybe, I have gotten used to having you around." "I have gotten used to being around," she admitted softly. "Then stay. We will make it proper. Mrs. Patterson could come out to chaperone, or you could ride back to town in the evenings if you prefer. But you should be here for the full days, see how everything connects. The leather work to the ranching to the horsemanship, all of it." Victoria knew she should refuse. It was too forward, too risky for her reputation. But when she looked at Quinton, at the hope carefully guarded in his eyes, she found herself nodding. "All right. But I will ride back to town each evening. I do not want to impose." "You are not an imposition, Victoria. You are the first person who has looked at my work and seen it as something worth preserving. Do you know what that means to me?" She did know, because she felt the same way. In all her years of research, no one had understood her work the way Quinton seemed to. He did not just tolerate her questions, he valued them. He saw her not as an odd spinster with peculiar hobbies, but as someone doing important work. The new arrangement began the following Monday. Victoria arrived at the ranch just after sunrise and stayed until the sun began to set. She documented everything. The way Quinton trained his horses using gentle, patient methods passed down from his grandfather. The herbs he used to treat minor injuries in his livestock. The way he read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. His method of breaking in new saddles so they would be comfortable for both horse and rider. But she also found herself doing more than just observing. She began helping with small tasks, holding pieces of leather steady while Quinton cut them, fetching tools, even learning to do simple stamping on scrap pieces. Her hands, accustomed only to pens and cameras, developed small calluses. She rather liked them. They fell into an easy rhythm. working side by side. Quinton would explain what he was doing and why, and Victoria would ask questions that often made him pause and think more deeply about techniques he had always taken for granted. "You make me see my own work differently," he said one day. "I never really thought about why I do things certain ways. I just do them because that is how I was taught. But when you ask why, I have to think about the reasons behind the tradition." "That is what good documentation does," Victoria said. "It does not just record, it helps us understand." As November arrived and the air grew cooler, Victoria realized with a start that she had been in Tonopah for nearly 3 months. Her original plan had been to stay 6 weeks at most, gathering material before moving on to another location. But she had not even begun to exhaust the material here, she told herself. There was still so much to learn from Quinton. She knew she was lying to herself. The research was part of it, yes, but not all of it. She had fallen in love with the ranch, with the wide Nevada sky, with the simple, honest life Quinton had built. And if she was being truly honest, she had fallen in love with Quinton himself. She did not know exactly when it had happened. Maybe it was watching his hands work leather with such skill and patience. Maybe it was the way he listened to her ideas without condescension. Maybe it was the rare, beautiful smiles that transformed his serious face. Or perhaps it was all of those things and 100 small moments besides. But loving him and being loved in return were different things entirely. Quinton was unfailingly kind and respectful, but he had given no sign that he saw her as anything more than a colleague, perhaps a friend. She told herself it was enough, that she should be grateful for his willingness to share his knowledge. She tried to ignore the way her heart leaped when she saw him each morning, or the way she treasured every accidental touch when they worked side by side. The first frost came in mid-November, coating the sage in silver. Victoria arrived at the ranch to find Quinton saddling his big bay gelding. "I need to ride out and check on the cattle," he said. "Make sure they are all right after the cold snap. Want to come along?" You could see more of the land, understand better how the ranch works. Victoria had been on a horse exactly 3 times in her life, all of them the short rides from town to the ranch. "I am not a very good rider. That mare you have been renting is gentle, and I will keep the pace easy." "Come on, Victoria. You cannot understand ranching from inside a workshop." She could not argue with that logic. 20 minutes later, she was mounted and following Quinton out across the range. Her seat was awkward and she knew she must look ridiculous, but Quinton was patient, giving her tips on how to move with the horse rather than against it. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, brown and gold under the pale blue sky. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. Victoria had never experienced such vastness. In Boston, the world was bounded by buildings and streets. Here, it seemed limitless. They found the cattle gathered near a spring. Quinton rode among them, checking their condition with practiced efficiency. Victoria watched, fascinated by how he could assess each animal with just a glance. "They look good," he said, riding back to her. "Should be fine through the winter if the weather does not get too harsh." They rode to the top of a small rise and Quinton dismounted. "Come on. There is something I want to show you." Victoria managed to get down from the mare without falling, which she considered a victory. Quinton led her to the edge of the rise, where they could see across miles of rangeland. The ranch buildings were visible in the distance, small and neat. "This is what I wanted when I came here," Quinton said quietly. "Space, freedom, the ability to live according to my own principles, not someone else's rules. Some people think I am crazy living out here alone, doing everything the hard way, but this feels right to me. This feels true." Victoria stood beside him, the wind tugging at her skirts. It is not crazy, it is brave. Most people do not have the courage to live according to their own values. He turned to look at her. You do. You came all the way out here, a woman alone, to study things most people think are not worth studying. You face down people who think you are wasting your time. That takes courage. Sometimes I wonder if I am wasting my time, if any of this matters. It matters, Quinton said fiercely. Victoria, what you are doing, preserving this knowledge, it matters. In 50 years, 100 years, people will want to know how we lived, how we worked. Your documentation will be the only record. That is not a waste. That is one of the most important things I can imagine. The conviction in his voice brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I needed to hear that. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Quinton said, his voice carefully casual, you know, you could stay. Not just for research. If you wanted, I mean, you could make this your permanent base. Study all the traditional crafts in Nevada, not just mine. The ranch could be your home. Victoria's heart began to pound. Quinton, what are you saying? He turned to face her fully, and the look in his gray eyes made her breath stop. I am saying that somewhere along the way, having you here stopped being about the documentation. I look forward to seeing you every morning. I miss you when you leave. I think about you when you are gone. And I know this is probably not what you want to hear, that I am probably just your research subject and nothing more, but I had to tell you. I had to be honest. Quinton, Victoria said, her voice shaking. Do you really think you are just a research subject to me? Hope flared in his eyes. Are you saying? I am saying that I fell in love with you weeks ago. Maybe longer. I tried not to because this was supposed to be a professional endeavor, but I could not help it. You are everything I have ever wanted and did not know I was looking for. For a moment, Quinton just stared at her. Then he closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his calloused hands. May I kiss you? Yes, she breathed. His lips met hers, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. Victoria had been kissed exactly once before, a chaste peck from a boy at a college party. This was nothing like that. This was fire and want and coming home all at once. She wrapped her arms around his neck and he pulled her closer, and the whole vast landscape seemed to spin around them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinton rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. I know we have not known each other long, and I know I am just a cowboy who makes saddles. But marry me, Victoria. Build a life with me here. We can document all the traditional crafts you want. We can preserve this way of life together. And I promise I will spend every day making you happy. You are not just a cowboy who makes saddles, Victoria said, laughing and crying at the same time. You are an artist and a scholar in your own right. And yes, Quinton Thorne, I will marry you. He kissed her again and then again, as if he could not quite believe she was real. I was so sure you would say no, that you would want to go back to Boston, to civilization. This is civilization, Victoria said. The real kind, built on skill and knowledge and living in harmony with the land. This is everything I have been searching for. They rode back to the ranch holding hands between their horses, laughing like children. When they arrived, Quinton swept her out of the saddle and spun her around, and Victoria felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne. We should tell people, she said breathlessly. We should tell Mrs. Patterson and Henry, and we will, Quinton promised. But first, just let me look at you. Let me believe this is real. They stood in the doorway of his workshop, the familiar smell of leather surrounding them, and Victoria knew she was exactly where she belonged. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Tonopah's small church. Mrs. Patterson cried and declared she had known all along. Henry served as Quinton's best man, looking pleased with himself for having introduced them. Victoria wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, which was all she could acquire on short notice, and Quinton wore his best suit, looking handsomer than she had ever seen him. The ceremony was brief and earnest. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinton kissed her with such tenderness that Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. They had a small celebration at the boarding house, with cake that Mrs. Patterson had made an awkward but heartfelt toasts from the townspeople who had come to know Victoria over her months in Tonopah. But what Victoria would remember most was the ride back to the ranch, their ranch now, as the sun set in streaks of gold and orange. Quinton held her close on the wagon seat, and they talked about their plans for the future. "I want to continue the documentation," Victoria said. "Not just of your work, but of all the traditional crafts in the area. We could create a comprehensive record." "We will need to build a proper darkroom for your photography," Quinton said thoughtfully. "And maybe a library to store all your notes and papers." "You would do that, Victoria. I am not marrying you despite your work. I am marrying you because of it, because you are passionate and brilliant and determined. Your research is important. We will make space for it." That night, in the ranch house that was now her home, Victoria discovered another kind of documentation entirely. The way Quinton's hands, so skilled with leather, could be even more skilled with her skin. The way his quiet intensity translated into devastating tenderness. She had read the medical texts, understood the mechanics, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of being loved by this man. Afterward, lying in his arms with moonlight streaming through the window, she whispered, "I did not know it could be like that." "Neither did I," Quinton admitted. "I have never been with anyone before." Victoria propped herself up to look at him. Never wanted to, not until you." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I am glad we waited, glad we are each other's first and only." She kissed him softly. "First and only. I like the sound of that." The winter months that followed were the happiest of Victoria's life. She settled into the rhythms of the ranch, learning alongside documenting. Quinton taught her to ride properly, and she discovered she had a natural seat once she relaxed. She learned to recognize the different horses by sight, to judge their moods and needs. She helped with the feeding and the endless small repairs that ranch life required. But she also continued her research with renewed vigor. Quinton built her a darkroom in one of the outbuildings, and she spent hours developing photographs of his saddles, his tools, his techniques. She filled notebook after notebook with detailed descriptions. And she began expanding her reach, riding into Tonopah regularly to interview other craftspeople, photographing their work, preserving their knowledge. In the evenings, she and Quinton would sit by the fire, and she would read him what she had written. He was an excellent editor, asking questions that forced her to clarify and deepen her explanations. Sometimes he would pick up his leatherwork, crafting by firelight while she wrote, and Victoria would pause just to watch his hands move, marveling that this skilled, patient man was her husband. Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the range. Victoria woke one April morning feeling queasy, and when the feeling persisted for several days, she consulted the medical text she had brought from Boston. Her hands shook as she counted back weeks, but the conclusion was unmistakable. She was pregnant. She told Quinton that evening, blurting it out over dinner before she lost her nerve. "I am going to have a baby, our baby, probably in late October." Quinton set down his fork, his face going pale. "A baby?" "Yes." "I know we did not plan for it to happen so soon, and it will complicate my research," but he was around the table in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms. "Complicated? Victoria, this is wonderful, amazing, terrifying but wonderful." She laughed against his chest, relief flooding through her. "You are happy." Happy does not begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you happy? Are you all right? I am wonderful, scared but wonderful. They began preparing immediately, even though the baby would not arrive for months. Quinton built a cradle from wood he had been saving, carving it with the same care he gave to his saddles. Victoria sewed tiny clothes, her hands clumsy with the unfamiliar work. Mrs. Patterson visited regularly, offering advice and encouragement. The pregnancy agreed with Victoria. Her morning sickness faded after the first few weeks, and she felt energized, almost radiant. She continued her research and documentation, though Quinton began to worry when her belly grew large. "You should not be riding all the way to town," he fretted. "I am pregnant, not fragile," Victoria retorted. "Women have been having babies while doing physical work for thousands of years. Not my wife, not if I can help it." They compromised. She would continue her work, but she would stay closer to home, focusing on documenting the ranch itself. She photographed the seasonal changes in the land, the process of foaling season, the way Quinton worked with young horses to gentle them. The project grew more comprehensive than she had originally envisioned, a complete picture of traditional Western ranching life. On a cool October evening, as Victoria was organizing her notes, her water broke. Quinton went white but kept his head, riding hard for town to fetch the midwife. Victoria labored through the night, supported by both the midwife and Mrs. Patterson, who had insisted on staying at the ranch for the final weeks. At dawn, as pink light filled the eastern sky, Victoria gave birth to a son. He came into the world squalling, healthy and strong, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Quinton held the baby with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. I cannot believe this is real." They named him James, after Quinton's grandfather. Baby James proved to be a good sleeper, for which Victoria was grateful. She had worried that motherhood would end her research, but she discovered she could write with a baby on her lap, could even operate her camera one-handed when necessary. Quinton was a devoted father, walking the floor with James when he fussed, changing nappies without complaint, singing him the same songs his grandfather had sung to him. Watching her husband with their son, Victoria felt her heart might burst with love. The years that followed fell into a beautiful pattern. Victoria's research expanded until she had documented not just saddle making but an entire way of life. She wrote articles that were published in academic journals, her work gaining recognition in scholarly circles. Quinton's saddles gained fame as well. People came from across Nevada and even from neighboring states to commission pieces. James grew into a curious, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions. Victoria would often find them in the workshop together, James watching with rapt attention as Quinton explained some technique or tool. She documented these moments too, photographing the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. When James was 3, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter, Sarah, arrived the following spring, tiny and fierce. Where James had been an easy baby, Sarah demanded attention, her cries imperious. But she also smiled easily and laughed often, bringing new joy to the household. The ranch prospered. Quinton's reputation brought steady commissions, and the cattle herd grew. They hired a young man named Peter to help with the ranch work, giving Quinton more time for his leather work. Victoria's publications brought a small income as well, enough to purchase equipment and supplies. But the best times were still the evenings, when the children were asleep and Victoria and Quinton would sit together on the porch, watching the sun set over the rangeland. They would talk about their day, their children, their dreams. Quinton still made her laugh with his dry observations, and she still challenged him to think more deeply about his craft. "You ever regret it?" Quinton asked one evening when James was 7 and Sarah 4. Giving up Boston, the academic world, all of that. Victoria looked at him in genuine surprise. Regret this? Quinton, I have published more important work here than I ever could have in Boston. I have documented an entire way of life that would otherwise have been lost. I have watched traditional crafts survive because of what we have preserved. How could I regret that? What about the rest of it? The society, the culture, the things you gave up. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I gave up nothing I valued. I gained everything I wanted. You, our children, this life. The work I do here matters more than any tea party or social gathering ever could. I love you, he said quietly. I do not say it enough, but I love you more than I can express. Show me, she whispered, pulling him toward the house, toward their bedroom, toward the life they had built together. More years passed. James grew tall and serious, inheriting his father's patience and skill. He learned saddle making and ranching both, taking to the work naturally. Sarah proved to be more like her mother, curious and questioning, always wanting to understand the why behind everything. Victoria taught her to use the camera, to develop photographs, to document the world around them. When Victoria was 34 and Quinton nearly 40, they had a final surprise. Twins, a boy and a girl they named Daniel and Emma. The ranch house rang with noise and laughter, and Victoria sometimes felt overwhelmed by the chaos. But Quinton was always there, steady and calm, helping with the children, supporting her work, being the partner she had never dared to hope she would find. Her documentation project had grown into something far larger than she had originally planned. She had boxes and boxes of photographs, shelves full of detailed notes, comprehensive records of traditional Western crafts and life. Academic institutions began requesting her materials, wanting to study them, preserve them. She corresponded with professors and researchers, sharing her findings, contributing to a growing understanding of this vital period in American history. But more importantly, the crafts themselves survived. Quinton took on apprentices, teaching them his grandfather's techniques. The young people he trained went on to establish their own workshops, creating a network of craftspeople committed to traditional methods. Victoria documented all of it, creating a record that would last for generations. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Quinton surprised her with a gift, a leather-bound book containing copies of all her research on his saddle making, beautifully organized and preserved. I wanted you to see what you have created, he said. Wanted you to understand how important your work is. Future generations will know how we lived because of you. Victoria wept as she turned the pages, seeing her life's work laid out so carefully. But more than the documentation, she saw the love that infused every page. This was not just academic research. This was the story of their life together, of the world they had built, of the knowledge they had preserved. That night, with their children asleep in their rooms, Victoria and Quinton made love with the passion and tenderness of long partnership. Afterward, lying in his arms as she had 1,000 times before, Victoria reflected on how completely her life had changed since that September day when she had arrived in Tonopah. I came to document traditional crafts, she murmured. I had no idea I would find everything I had ever wanted. What did you find? Quinton asked, his hand stroking her hair. You, this life, a purpose that matters, love that has only deepened with time, children who are growing into remarkable people, work that will outlive us both. She turned to look at him. You crafted a life I wanted to record, but more than that, you crafted a life I wanted to live. He kissed her softly. We crafted it together, your vision and my hands, building something that will last. The years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time brings. The children grew into adults. James took over most of the ranch operations and the saddle-making business, working alongside his father. Sarah moved to California to study photography at an art institute, but she returned often, bringing new techniques to combine with her mother's traditional documentation methods. Daniel became a veterinarian, applying his knowledge to the ranch animals. Emma married a young craftsman and opened a shop in Tonopah selling traditional handmade goods. Victoria's hair turned gray, then white, and her hands developed arthritis that made writing difficult. But she adapted, teaching Emma to be her assistant, dictating notes while Emma transcribed them. Her work continued, ever expanding, a comprehensive record of a way of life that was indeed disappearing as the 20th century progressed. Quinton's hands remained steady even as his hair grayed and his face lined. He could no longer work as many hours, but his skills had not diminished. The saddles he produced in his 60s were as fine as any he had made in his youth, perhaps finer for all the years of experience. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. James had married and had 3 children of his own. Emma had 2. The ranch house Victoria had once thought of as isolated seemed constantly full of family, of life, of love. 30 years, Quinton marveled, holding Victoria close as they watched their grandchildren play in the yard. It feels like yesterday and also like forever. Both, Victoria agreed. That is how time works when you are happy. It passes quickly, and yet each moment is full. As they entered their 40s together, Victoria began organizing her life's work for permanent archival. A university in California wanted her complete collection, promising to preserve it and make it available to researchers. She spent months preparing the materials, ensuring everything was properly cataloged and protected. The day she shipped the final boxes, she felt both satisfaction and melancholy. This work had defined so much of her life, but Quinton wrapped his arms around her and reminded her that the work was not ending, just changing form. "You preserved the knowledge," he said. "Now others can learn from it. That was always the goal." She leaned against him, grateful as always for his understanding. "I could not have done any of it without you. We were partners," he corrected. "In everything." They were blessed with good health, both of them remaining active well into their later years. Victoria continued to photograph and document, though now she focused on her own family, creating a visual history for future generations. Quinton still made saddles, though fewer, each one a masterpiece. Their 50th wedding anniversary was a grand affair. All their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch, along with friends from across Nevada and researchers who had used Victoria's work. There were speeches and toasts, but the moment Victoria treasured most was dancing with Quinton under strings of lights as the sun set. 50 years, she whispered. "How did we get so lucky?" "Not luck," Quinton said. "We chose this, chose each other, chose to build something that mattered." "I would choose it all again, every moment. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they made the good parts mean more." They continued dancing, 2 people who had spent half a century learning each other, loving each other, building a life that was both simple and profound. Victoria lived to be 76, healthy and sharp-minded until the last few months when illness finally claimed her. She died peacefully in the ranch house, surrounded by her family, holding Quinton's hand. Her last words were, "It was a beautiful life. Thank you for giving it to me." Quinton lived another 3 years, long enough to see Victoria's work gain even wider recognition as scholars began to appreciate her comprehensive documentation of traditional Western life. He continued making saddles almost to the end, his hands never forgetting the skills his grandfather had taught him, On a spring morning with wildflowers blooming across the range, Quinton passed away in his sleep. He was 84. His children found him in his bed, a small smile on his face as though he had seen something wonderful. They buried him beside Victoria on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could see the land they had loved spreading out in all directions. The headstones were simple, noting their names, their years, and a single line. They preserved what mattered, but the real legacy was not in stone. It was in the boxes of photographs and notes preserved in university archives, available to anyone who wanted to understand how people lived in the American West. It was in the saddles still being made using Quinton's techniques, passed down through his apprentices. It was in their children and grandchildren, who carried forward the values of craftsmanship and preservation. It was in the ranch itself, still operating, still producing, still honoring the traditional methods that Quinton and Victoria had believed in. James ran it with the same commitment to quality and authenticity that his father had demonstrated. And it was in the story itself, the tale of a woman who came to document traditional crafts and a cowboy who crafted a life she wanted to record. A story of two people who found in each other not just love, but partnership, who built something that lasted not because it was easy, but because it was true. Years later, a young researcher visiting the ranch to study Victoria's original photographs asked James what had made his parents' work so special, why their documentation had become so important to scholars of Western history. James thought for a long moment, then said, "My mother did not just photograph and describe what my father did. She understood why it mattered. She saw that the skills themselves were just the surface. What she really documented was a way of thinking, a way of approaching life. The belief that things should be made well, that knowledge should be preserved, that tradition has value, and she lived that way herself. Her research was not just observation, it was participation. She and my father created something together, and that is what makes her work so vital. It is not just documentation, it is love made visible." The researcher wrote down those words, and they eventually appeared in the introduction to the published collection of Victoria's work, and people who read them understood that this was more than just a historical record. It was a testament to what two people can build when they share values, vision, and deep, abiding love. The ranch still stands in Nevada, operated by the fourth generation of Thornes. The workshop where Quinton made his saddles has been preserved as a museum filled with his tools and examples of his work. Visitors can see Victoria's cameras, her notebooks, the documentation that captured a vanishing world. But more than that, they can see the evidence of a partnership that changed both lives and created something lasting. They can understand that sometimes the most important discoveries we make are not about the subjects we came to study, but about ourselves and what we are capable of when we find someone who sees us, truly sees us, and loves us for exactly who we are. Victoria came to Tonopah to document traditional crafts. She found Quinton Thorne, a cowboy who crafted saddles with his hands and a life with his heart. Together, they created something more beautiful and more enduring than either could have imagined. They showed that love and work, passion and purpose, tradition and progress can all coexist when people are willing to build thoughtfully, live authentically, and cherish what truly matters. Their story became part of the landscape they loved, preserved not just in archives but in the memories of those who knew them, and the legacy they left behind. A legacy that proved the old crafts were worth saving, that traditional knowledge has value, and that two people who dare to live according to their deepest principles can change the world in quiet, profound ways. And on that hill overlooking the ranch, where wildflowers bloom every spring and the wind carries the scent of sage, the headstones stand as simple markers of extraordinary lives. Lives that were crafted with the same care and skill Quinton brought to his saddles, documented with the same passion and precision Victoria brought to her research, and lived with a love that deepened and endured through 5 decades of partnership. It was, in every sense, a life worth recording, a love worth remembering, a story that proves that sometimes, when we follow our passions to unexpected places, we find not just the subjects we came to study, but the home we were always meant to discover.